Hi everyone. Today I have a word or two to say about representation. And I know my friends and family, everyone who is dear to me, are thinking to themselves, when don't you have a word or two to say about representation? Because representation is one of my pet issues. But it's interesting that sometimes something happens, I see something online that I really feel the need to respond to specifically, even though it is on a subject that I talk a lot about. Well, there has been a lot of conversation on the site formerly known as Twitter about the upcoming Star Wars movie starring Daisy Ridley as Rey. And Rey is a character that a lot of Star Wars fans absolutely hate. And they don't understand why this character was needed, specifically why little girls needed this particular character in order to get into Star Wars. They will point out that Princess Leia, who came before her, was a much better written character, and even Padme Amidala, at least in the first two of the prequel films, was also a better written character, and so forth and so on. But this isn't about Star Wars. I wanted specifically to talk about a post that I saw in the midst of one of these conversations. You shouldn't have to have a character of your own gender to identify with. Now, taken on the face of that, he's not saying anything I don't agree with. There is actually no word in that particular post that I would dispute. He's essentially saying, if you're a female viewer, you should have the empathy and imagination to stretch so that you can identify with the male hero or the male sidekick or any male character. There doesn't have to be a woman or a girl around for you to connect with. Again, on the face of it, on the surface of it, I don't really disagree with him. And after all, over the course of my life, I have seen plenty of movies and I've read plenty of books that have had no real female characters of any substance that were still worth reading to me, and male characters whom I have identified with quite strongly. Characters like Paul in All Quiet on the Western Front by Remarque. Of course, it's a World War I Western Front story. It's not going to have any women in there. And characters in the Iliad, very male-heavy. A lot of my childhood reads animal fantasies, where you have so many male characters, and if there's one female character around, she's really kind of boring. So, and of course The Hobbit, which has no female characters at all, as I am not talking about the regrettable movie version that Peter Jackson directed a few years back. I'm not talking about that trilogy. I'm talking about the book itself. And even Lord of the Rings. There are women in the Lord of the Rings, but they have very, very little page time. So obviously, if I couldn't identify with male characters, then I probably wouldn't be able to find any joy in those particular books. So, yeah, in that sense, he's right. But here's where I dispute. The question is not whether or not female viewers or readers can identify with male characters. The question is, should they have to? Should they be given movie after movie, or story after story, or TV show after TV show, where the only really interesting characters, the only really powerful characters, the only really active characters are men. Now, you might say, well, it isn't like that today. And that's true. It isn't like that today. Things are much better now in terms of representation than they were when I was growing up. Certainly, I went through times, particularly in my late childhood and then on through adolescence, where I was very frustrated because I could find so few. All the characters I liked were male characters. And why couldn't I find a female character that spoke to me? And so while I would identify with male characters, I would flip them in my head so that in my imagination, in my fanfic version of the story that would play in my head, those characters would become female. Just because I needed a heroine that badly, and if fiction wasn't going to give me one, I would make my own. So yes, things are better today than they were back when I had to do that. The problem is that for a lot of people, they don't see things as being better. They actually would rather things went back a little bit more toward the way they were back in the 80s. Back when you had franchises like Indiana Jones and Back to the Future and movies like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where you had these energetic, take charge, active male heroes who could be funny, who could save the day. And sure, those characters are great. But let's think for a minute. If you're watching Back to the Future, is Lorraine the character you're going to want to connect with? No, of course not. You gravitate toward Marty because he's the most interesting person. Or you may gravitate toward Doc Brown because I said Marty was the most interesting person, but he's not. It's really Doc Brown. He's a much more entertaining character. And when I first saw Back to the Future, he was the one that I identified with because he was fun and Christopher Lloyd had presence. But nobody's going to identify with Lorraine or Jennifer in the sequel. That's not who we're going to connect to. In Indiana Jones, well, maybe some of us might feel some sort of kinship with Marion in the first film, but we're not going to imprint on dim bulb shrieking Willie Scott in Temple of Doom, and probably not evil Nazi Elsa in Last Crusade. Who are we going to identify with? Whose shoes are we going to want to step into? Of course, the male hero. There's nothing wrong with having to do that sometimes. There is something wrong if male characters worth identifying with outnumber female characters worth identifying with something like 100 to 1, or maybe 10 to 1 the way it is now. So, yes, we can identify with male characters. And sometimes we need to. But we ought to have a choice. We ought to have more choices in terms of who is worth identifying with. It shouldn't always be the straight white guy. That is all.